y'all, and welcome back. Today I'm going to teach you how to make my color changing dragon scale tumbler using the Thermo Rainbow Gel from PDB Creative Studio. So stay tuned. We're starting with a 16-ounce Hyped Kewlzie from the Steel Magnolia. I've already sanded this tumbler, but it does not need to be painted before we add the dragon scales. As you can see, I have multiple sizes of my double-sided adhesive. This is what we're going to use to attach our dragon scales to the tumbler. I start at the very bottom, and I leave a little bit of a gap. I always try to take the bigger size for the very first steps around the bottom. Make sure you stretch your double-sided adhesive all the way around, but make sure you don't have any wrinkles in it. And then you're just going to cut it and keep going. We're going to go all the way up the tumbler, just as far as we can go with this main size. And then as we get closer to the top, if we have to switch to the smaller size tapes, we can do that as well. So we just keep going, make sure everything's nice and neat, keep your double-sided adhesive as close to the previous piece that you can so that you don't have any gaps where your scales are not going to stick. The closer you can keep them without overlapping, the better off you're going to be, and the better adhesion that your cardstock scales are actually going to have. Now you can absolutely attach your scales using other methods, but I have found that this method is the quickest and cleanest for me. The very first tumbler that I did, I actually applied all of my scales with Mod Podge, and it was a nasty, sticky mess. So I've just found out that the double-sided adhesive actually works better for me, and it does stick really, really great. Now as I get close to the top of the tumbler, you're going to see that I do have to switch over to the smaller size of double-sided adhesive tape. That's generally normal. Most of the time you have to have the smaller one when you get to the very top, because you don't want to overlap your tape, and you definitely don't want it going over the rim, because that's just a mess to clean up. Now you may have saw that I have a little bit of a cheat when it comes to applying my dragon scales. I've originally found my pattern on Etsy, and I didn't want to set my scales individually, so I tweaked the pattern a little bit, attached the scales, welded them together, and now they all cut as one piece. Now I make sure when I cut these that I measure the diameter around the tumbler before I cut a whole bunch of them, because there's no point in cutting a whole bunch if you can't use them. These for the 16-ounce Hyped Kewlzie and normally the 20-ounce straights are cut at 1.25 inches tall by 9.5 inches around. You can see that I was sizing that to make sure before I started trying to attach them that it was going to fit all the way around. So I usually remove 2 to 3 pieces of the backing or protective covering on the double-sided tape to allow myself plenty of room to set that first round of scales. I do not go all the way to the very bottom, because if you do, you're going to have jagged edges on the tumbler that you're never going to be able to get smooth. So I do leave a little bit of a gap at the very bottom when adding that first piece of the dragon scales. Make sure after you get them applied, press them down firmly. You want to make sure everything is attached properly, and then you'll continue moving up the cup. Again, I generally remove, once I start going up the cup, 2, sometimes 3 pieces of the cover if I have to, but you definitely don't want to remove all of it at once, because then you're going to have pieces of who knows what stuck to the tumbler before you get your dragon scales on there. Now my dragon scales I do cut out of heavy cardstock. I generally go ahead and buy the black cardstock, because you're going to have to spray paint the tumbler black anyway, because the Thermo Rainbow Gel only shows up and only gives you your color shift on dark colors. You could use a dark green or a very dark purple and maybe even a dark blue, but black gives you the full color spectrum when you're looking for the color change that this is going to give you. You're actually going to get anywhere from 10 to 12 colors when you put it on a black background. Now you will notice as you go around the tumbler that sometimes you have some variations where the scales don't line up perfectly. That is absolutely fine. Sometimes they either didn't cut perfectly straight or maybe you're laying it down a little bit crooked, but as long as they line up in the end, everything will work out. We are going to be spray painting the tumbler black, so if we do have any kind of stainless steel showing once we get all the scales placed, it'll be covered up once we spray paint it anyway. As you get to the very top of the tumbler, your last round of scales will hang over the tumbler. Don't worry about that. You'll be able to cut that off and trim those up and make them look uniform in the next step. Now that all your scales have been placed, make sure you firmly roll it across the surface where you can press all of those scales down to make sure they are tightly stuck to the surface. Now we're going to take our X-Acto knife or our razor blade and we're going to trim off those little pieces that we folded towards the top where the scales were hanging over. We're going to very carefully, very slowly cut those off because we don't want to tear them and we don't want to pull off that top layer of scales. Now you're going to take your Mod Podge and you are going to thoroughly coat the scales from top to bottom. When I say thoroughly coat, I mean a very, very good coat of Mod Podge. You do not want to skimp on your Mod Podge on this step because if you do in the long run, your tumbler is not going to turn out the way you expect. You want to make sure that that Mod Podge seals every one of those cardstock pieces completely so that your epoxy does not seep into them and make them look uneven, make them look wet, or even pull them off the tumbler. So make sure when you're putting on your Mod Podge, you put a very, very good coat all the way around, top to bottom. Make sure the rim is coated, the bottom is covered, and all of your scales. Once I get this good thick coat of Mod Podge on the tumbler, I'm going to let it dry completely. That way everything is sealed in. And then I'm going to use my rim cutting tool from Camipaige Boutique. I'll have it linked in the description below, to cut a nice smooth rim around the top so that your epoxy has a nice smooth surface to adhere to all the way around. After I have cut a nice smooth rim around the top, I'm going to make sure to add 2 more coats of Mod Podge before I move on to painting the tumbler. I add 2 more coats just for good measure to make sure that absolutely everything is coated and sealed because I'm not going to give epoxy a chance to get to these scales and mess up this tumbler after I've already done all this work. Make sure you give it time to thoroughly dry between each layer of Mod Podge. Once you've added the third layer of Mod Podge and that's completely dried, you can then take the tumbler and you're going to spray it a matte black. I use the Rustoleum 2X Ultra Matte Black. Give it a good even coat, and then you can move into adding your Thermo Rainbow Gel. Once the tumbler is completely dry from your spray paint, you're going to take your Rainbow Thermo Gel, and I pour out usually about a $1/2 amount into a cup so that I don't have to dip into the container or contaminate the other material that's left in the container. I'll pour it out into an extra cup, something that I can mix it with and things like that, mix it up easily, and also have enough room to get a paintbrush into. So I'm going to pour out about a $1/2 amount, and you're also going to see that I do take my bottled water and I'm going to add 3 to 5 drops of water to my pigment to thin it out just a little bit, to make it a little bit easier to brush on. I do like to use a chip brush because it does give the dragon tumbler a little bit more detail, a different type of texture. So I do like to use the little cheap chip brushes for that, and adding a few drops of water thins that pigment down just enough. But be sure, do not add any more than 3 to 5 drops of water, because you're going to thin it out too much and then you're not going to get the color change that you were looking for. Once you have everything mixed up thoroughly, you're going to take your chip brush, you're going to dip it into your pigment, and you're very lightly going to start painting that onto the tumbler. You want to use very light strokes. The Thermo Rainbow Gel is a water-based product, which means that if you add too many layers or you add too much pressure, it's actually going to start pulling itself back off the tumbler and you won't have the desired effect that you wanted. So be sure just to go around the tumbler very lightly. You're going to add another coat anyway, so make sure it's very lightly coated, but make sure everything's coated, top and bottom, and all your scales, but very lightly, so you're not pulling that pigment back off on the very first coat. I do like to use a hairdryer or a heat gun on a very cool or low heat setting to dry the first layer of pigment. That way I can make sure that everything is going to start changing colors. I can make sure everything's pretty well coated, and that first coat will kind of tell me in the end how many coats I think I'm going to need. Most of the time 2 coats are absolutely plenty. Sometimes you can get away with 1, but absolutely no more than 3. If you add more than 3 coats to the tumbler, it's going to start doing what I was talking about with pulling the pigment back off, and you're going to be left with just the black base and you've pulled all of your color back off. So I try to stick with 2 coats. Generally that's going to give you plenty of color shift, but if you have to go to a 3rd coat, maybe you thinned it out too much the second go around or something like that, I would do no more than 3 at all. Also, be very careful with your heat source when you're drying the first layer of pigment. Do not leave your heat source in one location too long, because it can cause the pigment to burn and then you won't get your color shift at all. once you've added your 1 or 2 coats of pigment and you're happy with the color shift and color change that you're getting, once that second coat or that final coat, whichever you're doing, is completely dry, you can move into epoxy. There is no need to seal. Like I said, this being a water-based product, a lot of times sealers can pull the coat off. So I'm going to do a minimum of 2 coats of epoxy. Then I'm going to sand the rim to expose the small line of stainless steel. Add your decal if needed, and then epoxy till smooth. So that's it, guys. Be sure to hit the like button if you like this video, hit the bell button to be notified when I post videos, and hit the subscribe button if you're not subscribed already. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you next time.